Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Trinity stamps. Today we're going to be using the Let Love Grow stamp set to be creating a one-layer card with some fake dimension. So I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I also have a piece of masking paper here that is cut down to 3 3/4 by 5, and I'm just centering that right in the middle of my card panel there. And I'm going to be adding a little bit of color to the edges with Rusty Hinge and Wild Honey Distress inks. I'm going to start off with the Rusty Hinge, which is the darkest color, and I'm just mainly going around the mask itself just to make the edges just a little bit darker. And then I'll move on to the Wild Honey and pretty much just cover up the rest of the area. These colors ended up being pretty similar, so I didn't really get all that much contrast. But we're going to be adding a shadow with our Copic markers later, so that dimension doesn't really matter too much right now. Now you can certainly use Distress Oxides here. Being I'm going to be going over this area with my markers, I prefer to use regular Distress inks. Distress Oxides can get a little bit muddy at times with any alcohol marker, but they still remain wet, just as Distress Oxides would. So when you're peeling up your mask, you just want to be careful that you don't tear your paper as you peel that up. Once that was done, we're going to go ahead and stamp our image in the corners, in 2 of the corners of our card panel. So I'm going to be using 2 pieces of Post-it note tape just to mask off the areas where we did our ink blending. And I'll be stamping the large image from the stamp set with blackout ink, which is Copic safe. And I'm going to stamp that right there in the corner, right on top of my Post-it note tape. Once that was down, I used that same Post-it note tape to mask out the diagonal corner, and I'll stamp my image again. Now you can certainly use a stamp positioner here if you want your images to be exactly the same, but I didn't really care too much if they were not exactly the same, but they were pretty similar. I did end up getting a good impression on both ends. Once that was stamped out, I removed my Post-it note tape and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. And I won't show you all of the coloring here. I'll just basically show you just one of the images. I wanted to stick to blues and blue-greens. So for this largest succulent right there in the center, I'm going to start off with my lightest color. This is the B91, and I'm just mapping out my darkest areas. I'm ignoring that some of the petals are kind of folded over on themselves. I was initially going to add a shadow there, but I decided to keep this pretty simple. I am creating shadows where one petal is laying underneath another one, and mainly my darkest areas will be right there in the center of, towards the center of the succulent, where the petals all kind of meet in the middle. Once I had my darkest areas laid out, I moved on to my darkest color, which is the B99, and I'm just adding the very darkest areas. So mainly it's just going to be my shadows where one petal is laying underneath another. For the larger petals, I am doing just a few little flicks, but for the most part, my darkest areas are just going to be a straight line with just the tip of my marker barely touching the paper. Once I had my darkest color down, I'll move on to my darkest midtone, which is the B97, and I'll just extend those areas out a little bit. I'll extend those lines out a little bit thicker, and I'll extend my flicks on some of those larger petals out a little bit further. Once I had that down, I'll move on to my lightest midtone color, which is the B95. And this is a natural blending family. These are all B90 markers, so you'll really get good results if you stick to a natural blending family. So for the B95, I'm doing the same thing, extending those flicks out almost to the edges or the ends of each of the petals. Some of the larger petals that are laying right next to or right over another petal, I'm leaving the edges as well on either side left for my highlight color as well, just to give it a little bit more dimension. Finally, once my lightest midtone was down, I'll move on to my lightest color. This is the highlight color. It is a B91, and this is pretty much a significant change enough to give you a lot of contrast. just filling in the rest of the petals, doing a few little flicking motions just to get a better blend, because I did skip over the B93, which would have been the next one in line, I guess. And once this first succulent was colored, we'll move on to the next one, and I'm going to switch over to some BG markers. And I'm pretty much doing the same thing here, starting off with my lightest color. This is the BG 72, and mapping out my darkest areas, which pretty much for these petals are just going to be where they're laying underneath another petal. And then I'll move on to my darkest color, which is the BG78, and go over those same areas. And I'm not doing any kind of flicking at all on this particular succulent. I am just doing one straight line or one line along those shadowed areas. Doing the same thing with my BG75 and just extending those lines out, making them a little bit thicker, just leaving the edges or the tips of each of the petals left for my highlight color, and I'll go back to the BG72 and fill the rest of that in. Now there are a few succulents that are kind of hanging off the page there, so you can't really tell what they are. So I'm just going to go in with some B markers and fill those in, not really too worried about my shading, because if I can't tell what they are, neither can the person that's going to be receiving the card. So I'm going to start off with my lightest color, or what was going to be my lightest color, which is the B14, and mapping out my darkest areas. And I'm going to color both of these succulents with the same color combination. And I'm just mainly concentrating my darkest areas to be in the center. Next, I'll move on to my B18 and go over those same exact areas for my darkest color. Then move on to the B16 and the B14, and realized I just wasn't getting enough contrast with the BG14 being my lightest color. So for that one succulent there on the very top, I skipped over the B14 and I'll move right to the B12 just to get a little bit more of a contrast. Once that was done, we'll go ahead and color these little gems here. And I'm going to be using some Y and YR markers, but coloring them pretty much the same as I did with the succulents, starting off with my lightest color, which is the Y08, and mapping out my darkest areas. My darkest areas are pretty much going to be where there is, I don't know what you'd call them, where the gem would be cut, I guess. And just doing one straight line. With the YR68 going over those same areas, blending that out with my Y38. And I also created with my darkest midtone some shadows where these gems are kind of laying underneath some of those succulents, and that gem in the back is hanging or laying underneath that front one. Next, I'll go in with the Y35 and extend those areas out a little bit further, and then finally back to my Y08 and filling in that entire area. And I colored the other image the same exact way. Now you'll see that there's some white space where I probably should have stamped it down a little bit further. So I'm just going to color this in solid with some BG markers. Starting off with my BG15, mapping out my darkest areas, which will just pretty much be underneath that main succulent there. Going in with my BG18, blending that back out with my BG15, and realized I wanted a little bit more contrast, so I'll bring in my BG11 and just blend the rest of that out. Now, in order to make these images and this panel look like it's kind of popped up a little bit, we're going to be creating a shadow. So I'm using my C markers and going right in with my darkest color, which is my C5. And concentrating on having the same light source. It doesn't matter what your light source is, just as long as they match. So for this top one here, I'm going to create a shadow on the bottom of my image. And for this bottom one, I'm going to create a shadow off to the left. I'll blend that out with my C3 a little bit further and maybe add some additional shadows that would be smaller and less significant, so I didn't use my darkest color on those areas. Finally, going in with my C1 and extending those shadow areas out a little bit further. Now for the panel itself, I wanted to make it look like the white part of the panel is popped up from the part that we did the distress ink blending for. So I'm going to bring out my T-squared ruler because I don't trust myself in drawing a straight line. I'm going to start off again with my C5 and just drawing a line on 2 of the sides, again using the same light source as I did for the images themselves. And then I'll go in with my C3 and extend that line out a little bit further. I did skip my C1 here because of the distress ink background. It wouldn't be noticeable, so I just totally skipped that color. Once all of my coloring was done, I will move on to the sentiment, and I'm using the sentiment from that same stamp set and just arranging that on my card panel the way I want it. I did end up bringing in my stamp positioner here just to make sure that I was stamping these words correctly and straight, and I'll be stamping these with a VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I did add a little bit of shimmer just to the gems there with a shimmer pen by Nuvo. And I wanted to add a few little embellishments. Even though this is a 1-layer card, I do usually add some Nuvo drops or some sequins. So I'm using some sequins that are also by Trinity Stamps and just arranging them around my sentiment right directly on my card panel. And I'll adhere those down with some Ranger Multi-Matte Medium. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.